Did you know that most people spend their entire lives talking, but never really understand what's going on inside the mind of the person in front of them? Now imagine having the ability to uncover someone's deepest thoughts using just 3 simple questions. Sounds impossible. Socrates, the philosopher who changed the world without ever writing a single word, had mastered this skill, and today you're going to learn exactly how he did it. Look, I need to tell you something that can completely change the way you relate to the people around you. We're talking about a method so powerful that it scared the leaders of Athens enough to sentence Socrates to death. Why? Because he had the ability to make anyone question their own certainties, expose their contradictions, and reveal what they truly believed without even realizing it. And the most incredible part? He did all of this simply by asking questions. Before we go any further, if you want to learn powerful techniques of practical philosophy that can genuinely transform your life, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. What you're about to discover in the next few minutes is so valuable that many people would rather it stayed hidden. And trust me, the final insight in this video is the most impactful of all. So let me ask you something. How many times have you talked to someone and felt like they were hiding something? Or worse, how many times have you struggled to express what you were really thinking or feeling? The truth is, we live in a world where people talk a lot but say very little. Conversations are shallow, relationships are superficial, everyone wants to be heard, but almost no one truly listens. Socrates lived more than 2,400 years ago in Athens, in ancient Greece. He left behind no written books, no philosophical treatises, no complex theories recorded on scrolls. And yet, he's considered one of the most influential thinkers in human history. How is it possible that a man who never wrote anything shaped humanity so deeply? The answer lies in the way he asked questions. While other philosophers of his time wrote long speeches trying to convince people of their truths, Socrates did the opposite. He walked through the streets of Athens, talking with merchants, politicians, craftsmen, young people and elders, and he simply asked questions that seemed simple on the surface, but were devastatingly effective. Questions that led people to contradict themselves, doubt their own convictions, and eventually realize they didn't know as much as they thought they did. This approach became known as the Socratic method, or meutics, which literally means the art of bringing things to light. Just as a midwife helps bring a child into the world, Socrates believed questions could bring ideas into existence. He believed true knowledge already lives inside each person, waiting to be uncovered through the right questions. And that's exactly what you're going to learn how to do today. Now, before I reveal these 3 powerful questions, there's something important you need to understand. This knowledge isn't meant to be used in a manipulative or malicious way. Socrates was condemned to death precisely because his method was so powerful that it threatened the established order. He exposed the ignorance of the powerful, revealed the contradictions of the arrogant, and showed that many who claimed to be wise were, in reality, deeply uninformed. So pay close attention, because what comes next can permanently change the way you communicate. The first thing you need to understand is that reading someone's mind doesn't mean being psychic or having supernatural powers. It means understanding how human thinking works, recognizing patterns of reasoning, and knowing how to ask questions that lead people to reveal their true beliefs and motivations. Socrates discovered something revolutionary. Most people live on autopilot. They repeat opinions they heard somewhere, defend viewpoints they've never truly examined, and make decisions based on emotions they can't even name. When you ask the right questions, you force someone out of that autopilot mode and make them actually think. And that's where the magic happens. Think about it for a second. When was the last time someone asked you a question that genuinely made you stop and reflect? A question without an easy answer, one that challenged you to look inward and examine your own beliefs? It was probably a long time ago. That's because we live in a culture of quick answers, rushed opinions, and absolute certainty about complex topics. Socrates saw this in Athens over 2,000 years ago, and the problem has only intensified today. People want to sound intelligent, so they speak confidently about things they barely understand. They want to seem confident, so they hide their doubts and insecurities. They want to be accepted, so they agree with popular opinions even when they disagree deep down. And here's the secret Socrates uncovered. Behind that facade of certainty, there's an ocean of doubt. Behind every strong opinion, there's a set of unexamined assumptions. And when you know how to ask the right questions, you can navigate that ocean and reach the depths where a person's true beliefs and motivations actually live. Here we go, straight to the point. What are the 3 questions Socrates used to read people's minds? Before I reveal them, I need to tell you a story that perfectly shows the power of this method. One day, a young Athenian, full of certainty and confidence, approached Socrates on the streets of Athens. He was upset because his father had made a decision he believed was deeply unfair. The young man wanted Socrates to agree with him, to validate his anger. But Socrates, being Socrates, didn't do that. Instead, he started asking questions. The conversation lasted for hours. By the end, the young man had not only completely changed his opinion about the situation with his father, but he also realized that many of his beliefs about justice and family were full of contradictions. He walked away transformed, not because Socrates told him what to think, but because the questions forced him to think for himself, maybe for the first time in his life. So here's the first question. It's so simple you might think it can't possibly work. But trust me, it does. The first question is, what exactly do you mean by that? Sounds basic, right? But hold on, because this seemingly innocent question goes much deeper than it appears. When someone makes a statement, whether it's about politics, relationships, work, or anything else, they usually rely on vague, abstract language. They say things like, that's unfair, this is wrong, people are selfish, the world is falling apart. But what do those words actually mean? What does fair mean to that person? What do they personally consider right or wrong? Which people are they generalizing? What part of the world are they really talking about? Socrates realized that most people never stop to define the concepts they use every single day. They hear these words, repeat them, and pass them along without ever thinking deeply about what they actually mean. So when you ask, what exactly do you mean by that? You're forcing someone to do something they almost never do. Think precisely. Let me give you a practical example. Imagine someone says, the education system is broken. Instead of agreeing or arguing, you ask, what exactly do you mean by the education system being broken? They might respond, well, schools don't teach useful real-world skills. Then you follow up with, when you say real-world skills, what specifically are you talking about? See what's happening? With every question, you're peeling away layers of generalization and getting closer to what the person actually thinks. And here's the interesting part. Very often, the person realizes they haven't thought about it nearly as much as they assumed. They were repeating an opinion, not expressing a deeply examined belief. If you're finding value in this, and it's making you think differently, hit the like button on this video. It really helps, and it tells me you want more content like this. And feel free to comment which of these techniques you'd want to try first. Now let's move to the second question, and this one is even more powerful. The second question Socrates used was, how did you arrive at that conclusion? This question is devastating because it exposes the person's reasoning process. And most people, when faced with this question, realize they don't actually have a solid logical process. They arrived at that conclusion through emotion, social influence, habit, or repetition, not through careful thinking. Think about how many opinions you hold that you've never truly examined, political views you absorbed from your family, beliefs about relationships shaped by movies and TV shows, ideas about money you inherited from your parents without ever questioning. When someone asks, how did you arrive at that conclusion? You're forced to trace the origin of your thinking, and often you discover that thought isn't really yours. Socrates was famous for using this question with politicians. A politician would defend a certain law, and Socrates would ask, "How did you arrive at the conclusion that this law is just?" The politician would explain, and Socrates would follow up with, "And how do you know that's true?" With each answer, it became clearer that the politician was relying on unproven assumptions, unexamined biases, and circular logic. Here's a modern example. Someone says, "Social media is bad for mental health." And you ask, "How did you arrive at that conclusion?" They might say, "I read an article about it." Then you ask, "How did the author reach that conclusion? What evidence did they use? Did you check that evidence? Are there studies that suggest the opposite? Could there be other factors involved?" Notice how a statement that seemed solid starts to reveal cracks. I'm not saying social media is good or bad. That's not the point. The point is that most of our opinions have never gone through this level of scrutiny. We hear something that sounds reasonable, that confirms what we already believe, or that comes from someone we respect, and we accept it as truth. Socrates had a term for this. He called it unexamined opinion, and he believed that a life built on unexamined opinions was a wasted life. His most famous quote captures this perfectly. "The unexamined life is not worth living." That's a strong statement. But think about it. If you've never examined your beliefs, your values, your motivations, then you're not really living your own life. You're living a life programmed by others. Now, before I reveal the third and most powerful question, there's an important warning. This method is not about winning arguments or making people feel stupid. Socrates didn't ask questions to humiliate anyone. He asked questions because he genuinely wanted to help people think more clearly, discover their own contradictions, and reach stronger conclusions. In fact, Socrates was known for his irony. He would begin by saying he knew nothing, that he was ignorant, and that he wanted to learn from the other person. Only then would he start asking questions. This humility was real. Socrates truly believed he knew far less than people assumed, and by acknowledging his own ignorance, he became wiser than those who believed they already knew everything. There's a famous story about this. The Oracle of Delphi, considered the voice of the gods in ancient Greece, declared that Socrates was the wisest man in all of Athens. When Socrates heard this, he was confused. How could he be the wisest if he was so aware of how little he knew? So he decided to test the oracle. He went around speaking with everyone considered wise in Athens, politicians, poets, craftsmen, teachers, and here's what he discovered. All of them believed they knew far more than they actually did. They had knowledge in their specific fields, yes, but they assumed that expertise made them wise about everything, and worse, they had never critically examined even the knowledge they claimed to possess. That's when Socrates understood the oracle's message. He was the wisest, not because he knew more, but because he was the only one who truly recognized his own ignorance. Now it's time to reveal the third question, and this one is the most powerful of all. But before I do, I need to prepare you for the impact it can have. Socrates' third question had the power to completely dismantle arguments, expose contradictions, and reveal the real motivations behind people's words. It was so effective that many of Socrates' enemies became his enemies, precisely because he used this question against them in public. The third question is what you're saying consistent with other things you believe? Or more directly, aren't you contradicting yourself? This question is devastating because it exposes something most people don't realize about themselves. We all carry contradictory beliefs in our minds. Let me explain this with an example that will probably feel very familiar. Imagine someone who says, "Freedom is the most important value in society." Sounds noble, you likely agree. But then you ask, is that consistent with your belief that the government should ban certain behaviors you personally consider immoral? Boom, the contradiction shows up. That person values freedom, but only when it's the freedom to do what they approve of. When it's the freedom to do what they dislike, suddenly they want restrictions. Socrates was a master at spotting these contradictions. He spoke with people who claimed to value justice but defended laws that clearly harmed certain groups. People who said they were committed to truth but refused to look at evidence that challenged their beliefs. People who preached virtue in public but lived completely differently in private. And here's the crucial point. When you expose these contradictions, two things can happen. The person can become defensive, irritated, and start justifying the contradiction with weaker and weaker arguments. Or they can have a moment of real clarity, recognize the inconsistency, and begin to rethink their position. Socrates always hoped for the second reaction, but he often got the first. There's a powerful story that illustrates this perfectly. There was a famous sophist in Athens named Protagoras. The sophists were teachers who charged large sums of money to teach rhetoric and argumentation. They claimed they could teach anyone to defend any position, whether it was true or false. Protagoras had a famous saying, "Man is the measure of all things." What he meant was that there is no objective truth, that each person has their own truth. Socrates met Protagoras and began his sequence of questions. First, what exactly do you mean when you say that man is the measure of all things? Protagoras explained his theory of relativism. Then Socrates asked, how did you arrive at that conclusion? Protagoras laid out his arguments. Finally, Socrates asked the fatal question. If each person has their own truth, and someone believes you are wrong, then according to your own theory, that person is right in their truth, correct? So your theory contradicts itself, because if it's true, it must also be false for those who disagree with it. Protagoras had no answer. The contradiction was unavoidable. If there is no objective truth, then the statement, "There is no objective truth," cannot itself be objectively true. The theory collapses under its own logic. This style of reasoning became known as the Socratic elenchus, the art of refuting ideas by exposing their internal contradictions through questions. Now, you might be thinking, won't this make people hate me? Nobody likes having their contradictions exposed, and you're absolutely right. Socrates was hated by many for exactly this reason. But here's the real question. Do you want to live in a world of comfortable illusions or uncomfortable truths? Do you want relationships built on masks and pretending, or on honesty and authenticity? The Socratic method isn't meant to be used aggressively or arrogantly. Socrates always approached people with genuine curiosity and humility. He didn't say, "You're wrong and I'm going to prove it." He said, "I don't understand. Can you explain this to me?" And from that humble posture, he created a safe space for people to examine their own ideas without feeling attacked. Here's the secret that makes all the difference when applying this method. You have to be genuinely interested in understanding the other person, not in defeating them. When you ask these 3 questions with sincere curiosity, people feel it. They can tell you're not trying to make them look stupid, but that you're actually trying to understand how they think. In that atmosphere of mutual respect, people open up in ways that might surprise you. Think about the conversations you have every day. How often do you really try to understand the other person? How often do you ask genuine questions instead of just waiting for your turn to talk? How often do you consider that maybe you're the one who's wrong and the other person has something valuable to teach you? Those are the kinds of questions Socrates would be asking you right now. And here's what's most fascinating. Socrates applied this method to himself as well. He constantly questioned his own beliefs, examined his own contradictions, and tested his own opinions. He believed self-knowledge was the most important kind of knowledge. There's no point in understanding the whole world if you don't understand yourself. At the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, there was an inscription that read, "Know thyself." That was Socrates' life mission. And he discovered that the best way to know yourself was through dialogue, through conversation, through constant questioning. Not the shallow conversations we have every day, but deep dialogue that reaches the roots of who we are. When you use these 3 questions with others, you're actually practicing the art of self-knowledge. Because by listening to other people's arguments, noticing their contradictions, and understanding how they think, you inevitably start examining your own arguments, your own contradictions, and your own thinking patterns. Socrates held a deep belief. He believed that no one does wrong intentionally. According to him, people do harmful things because they're confused, because they don't truly understand what's good for them. If they truly knew, they would choose the good. That's why he dedicated his life to helping people think more clearly. He believed that clearer thinking naturally leads to better behavior. Now let me give you a few practical examples of how you can use these 3 questions in everyday life. Imagine you're in a family argument about politics. Instead of going into attack and defense mode, you use the Socratic method. Someone makes a strong political claim. You ask, what exactly do you mean by that? How did you arrive at that conclusion? Is that consistent with other things you believe? Or imagine you're at work. Your boss proposes a strategy you think is flawed. Instead of saying, this won't work, you ask, when you say this strategy will increase productivity, what exactly do you mean by productivity? How did you conclude that this specific approach will lead to that result? And is this consistent with the company values we've always talked about? See how the same questions can be applied in any context. That's the beauty of the Socratic method, its universality. It works in deep philosophical debates, and it works just as well in everyday conversations about any topic. And most importantly, it works because it's grounded in something fundamental about human nature. We all want to be consistent. We all want our beliefs to make sense, and deep down, we all value truth. But now I need to reveal something that very few people understand about these 3 questions. They aren't just tools for understanding others. They are, in fact, a mirror. When you ask these questions of someone else, you inevitably begin asking them of yourself, and that's where real transformation happens. Socrates discovered something revolutionary. The greatest obstacle to knowledge isn't ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. The hardest people to teach aren't those who admit they don't know, but those who think they already do. That's why he always began his conversations by admitting his own ignorance. He modeled intellectual humility and invited others to do the same. There was a young man in Athens named Alcibiades, incredibly intelligent, handsome, wealthy, and ambitious. Everyone predicted he would become a great leader, but Alcibiades had a problem. He was deeply arrogant. He believed he already knew everything worth knowing. Socrates saw enormous potential in him, wasted by arrogance, and decided to help. For years, Socrates engaged Alcibiades in conversation, asking his penetrating questions. Slowly, the young man began to realize how little he actually knew. He started questioning his certainties, he examined his motivations, and for a while, he truly changed. He became more humble, more reflective, wiser. But ambition eventually won. Alcibiades drifted away from Socrates and returned to his old habits. In the end, his arrogance and impulsive decisions led Athens into military disasters, and he died in exile, disgraced and forgotten. That story reveals something crucial. Knowing the right questions isn't enough. You need the courage to face the answers. You have to be willing to abandon comfortable beliefs when they turn out to be false. You need the humility to admit you were wrong. And that, my friend, is one of the hardest things there is. Think about how many times you've clung to an opinion even after it was clear you were wrong, just because admitting it would have been uncomfortable. How many times you avoided asking yourself certain questions because you were afraid of the answers. How often you chose a comforting illusion over an uncomfortable truth. We all do this. It's human nature, but Socrates challenges us to rise above that instinct. Now let me show you something even deeper. These 3 questions don't just reveal what people think, they reveal who they really are. Because in the end, we are what we consistently think. If you spend your life repeating unexamined opinions, living by values you've never questioned, holding contradictory beliefs, then who are you really? Are you truly yourself or just a product of the influences around you? Socrates believed there was a fundamental difference between living and merely existing. Animals exist. They follow instincts and react to stimuli. Humans, however, have the unique ability to examine their own lives, question their motivations, and consciously choose their values. When you fail to use that ability, you're wasting what makes you human. And here's something that might surprise you. Most people never truly use this capacity. They live on autopilot, following social scripts, repeating learned patterns, reacting emotionally without really thinking. They're like actors playing a role they never consciously chose, following a script written by someone else. But when you begin asking these 3 Socratic questions, first to others and then to yourself, something almost magical happens. You wake up, you step off autopilot, you start living deliberately and consciously. You become the author of your own life instead of a side character in someone else's story. Let me give you a powerful exercise that Socrates would have loved. Take any belief you hold about anything at all. Relationships, money, success, politics, religion, whatever. Now ask yourself these 3 questions honestly. What exactly do I mean when I say this? How did I come to this conclusion? Is this belief consistent with other things I believe? If you do this with brutal honesty, one of 2 things will happen. Either you'll discover that your belief is solid, well-grounded and consistent, and you'll walk away with more confidence in it. Or you'll realize it has holes and contradictions that you've never really thought it through. And in that case, you've been given a rare opportunity to build a better belief, one that's truer and more genuinely your own. Socrates did this constantly. He examined his own beliefs without mercy, and when he found a contradiction, he wasn't afraid to change his mind. To him, that wasn't weakness. It was the highest form of intellectual strength. Weak people cling to their opinions, even when they're clearly false. Strong people have the courage to evolve. There's a fascinating story about a debate Socrates had with a sophist named Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus argued that justice is nothing more than the interest of the stronger party. Those with power decide what's right and wrong. Morality, he claimed, is just an illusion invented by the powerful to control the weak. It was a cynical view, but he defended it passionately. Socrates began asking his questions. What exactly do you mean by the interest of the stronger? Thrasymachus explained. How did you reach that conclusion? Thrasymachus laid out his arguments. Then came the devastating question. If justice is the interest of the stronger, and the strong sometimes make mistakes about what's in their own interest, would they then be acting justly by harming themselves? Doesn't your definition contradict itself? Thrasymachus tried to push back, but the contradiction was obvious. If justice is simply the interest of the stronger, and the stronger can be wrong about their own interests, then justice would mean both benefiting and harming the stronger at the same time. The definition collapsed. Thrasymachus left the conversation angry, but without an answer. What Socrates was showing wasn't just that Thrasymachus's definition was flawed, he was pointing to something deeper. Attempts to reduce complex ideas like justice to simple formulas always fail. Reality is more nuanced than our easy definitions, and dealing with fundamental questions requires humility. Which brings us to a crucial point about the Socratic method. The goal isn't always to arrive at a final answer. Sometimes the goal is simply to realize that the question is more complex than we thought, that our understanding is limited, that we need to keep thinking, questioning, examining. Socrates called this wise ignorance, knowing that you don't know. In an age of instant answers, where any question can be answered with a quick online search, this idea of wise ignorance matters more than ever. Because access to information isn't the same as wisdom. You can know 1,000 facts and still understand nothing. You can have all the answers and still be asking the wrong questions. Socrates understood something our modern society often forgets. The quality of our questions determines the quality of our lives. If you ask shallow questions, you end up with a shallow life. If you ask deep questions, you build a deep life. And if you never question anything at all, You just drift through life without direction, without purpose, without really living. Now I need to tell you about the most dramatic moment of Socrates' life, because that's where the real power of these three questions shows itself in full. Socrates was put on trial. The charges were serious: corrupting the youth of Athens and not believing in the city's gods. The accusations were false, but the real reasons were obvious. Socrates had embarrassed powerful people with his questions. He had exposed the ignorance of influential politicians. He had shown that many respected citizens of Athens were hypocrites, and they wanted revenge. During the trial, Socrates had the chance to defend himself. He could have begged for mercy. He could have promised to stop asking uncomfortable questions. He could have used every rhetorical trick he knew to manipulate the jury's emotions. But he didn't do any of that. Instead, he kept asking questions. He asked his accusers, "What exactly do you mean when you say I corrupt the youth? How did you come to that conclusion? How is that claim consistent with the fact that many of my students became virtuous citizens?" One by one, he dismantled the arguments against him, using the same method he had used his entire life. Here's the incredible part. Socrates knew he was digging his own grave. He knew that by continuing to question and challenge his accusers, he was increasing his chances of being condemned. But he couldn't do otherwise. For him, living without questioning, living without seeking truth, was worse than death. He literally chose death over giving up his questions. The jury sentenced him to die. And even then, Socrates kept teaching. His friends planned an escape. They bribed the guards and arranged everything so he could flee Athens and live out his final years in safety. But Socrates refused. Why? Because he had spent his entire life defending the importance of living by principles. He taught that we should obey the laws of the city, even when we disagree with them, unless those laws are so unjust that they demand civil disobedience. So he asked himself the three questions. What does it really mean to live a life of integrity? How did I come to the conclusion that I should obey the laws of the city? Is this consistent with everything I've taught throughout my life? The answers led him to accept death. He drank the hemlock, the poison that would kill him, surrounded by his grieving friends, and spent his final hours doing what he had always done: philosophizing, questioning, teaching. This story shows something deeply important about the Socratic method. It's not just an intellectual technique, it's a way of life. It's a commitment to truth that goes beyond convenience, beyond comfort, even beyond survival itself. Socrates shows us that some things matter more than staying alive, living well, living with integrity, living according to the truth we discover through constant questioning. Now, you don't need to be willing to die for your questions the way Socrates was. But the lesson still stands. If you're not willing to question your own beliefs, if you don't have the courage to face uncomfortable truths, if you can't admit when you're wrong, you will never truly grow. You'll stay stuck in the same illusions, the same mistakes, the same self-destructive patterns. And here's something that might make you rethink everything. Socrates never wrote anything down. Everything we know about him comes from his students, especially Plato. Why didn't he write? Because he believed real philosophy happens in live dialogue, in real conversations between people, in the act of questioning and answering in real time. He thought writing froze thought, turning living ideas into dead dogmas. Think about that. How many books have you read where the author presents their ideas as absolute truths? How many times have you accepted something as true just because it was printed on a page? Socrates would have hated that. He wanted each person to reach their own conclusions through active questioning, not passively accept someone else's answers. And that brings us back to the three questions. When you ask, what exactly do you mean by that? You're refusing to passively accept someone's words. You're demanding clarity, precision, careful thinking. When you ask, how did you arrive at that conclusion? You're investigating the process, not just the result. You're saying, don't just tell me what to think. Show me how to think. And when you ask, is this consistent with other things you believe, you're demanding intellectual integrity, coherence, honesty. These three questions are really a declaration of intellectual independence. You're saying, I'm not just going to believe what you say, I'm going to examine it, question it, test it, and only then, if it holds up, will I take it seriously. And more importantly, you're applying the same standards to your own ideas. Now let me show you how these questions can literally save your life. I'm not exaggerating. How many bad decisions have you made because you accepted someone's advice without questioning it? How many times have you entered a destructive relationship, made a terrible investment, or chosen the wrong path because you didn't ask the right questions? Imagine if, before every major decision, you stopped and asked these three questions. What am I really trying to achieve with this decision? How did I conclude that this is the best option? Is this consistent with my values and my long-term goals? How many mistakes would you have avoided? How many opportunities would you have used better? Socrates had a student named Crito who was fiercely loyal to him. When Socrates was in prison awaiting execution, Crito came to visit and begged him to escape. Crito had all his arguments ready. People will think I didn't do enough to save you. Your children will be left without a father. The jury's decision was unjust. You have the right to live. But Socrates, being Socrates, started asking questions. Crito, should we care about what everyone thinks, or only about what wise people think? Crito agreed that we should care only about the opinion of the wise. And should we always do what is right, or should we do wrong when it benefits us? Crito agreed we should always do what is right. And is it right to disobey the laws under which we live, laws to which we gave our implicit consent by choosing to live in this city? Question by question, Socrates led Crito to recognize that escaping would be wrong, even if it was advantageous. Even if it was understandable, even if it was what his friends wanted. And Crito, through those questions, reached the conclusion on his own that Socrates should stay and face his sentence. He wasn't persuaded by emotional arguments or manipulative rhetoric. He was guided by logical questions to see the truth for himself. That's the real power of the Socratic method. When you convince someone with arguments, you might win the debate, but lose the person. They may agree on the surface while disagreeing deep down, but when you guide someone through questions to discover the truth for themselves, the change is deep and lasting, because now it's not your idea they've accepted. It's an idea they discovered on their own. Now let's get to what really matters. You've learned Socrates' three questions. You understand their power. You've seen how they can turn shallow conversations into deep dialogues, how they expose contradictions, how they uncover hidden truths. But the crucial question is this: what are you going to do with that knowledge? Because here's the hard truth: knowing isn't enough. Socrates didn't become Socrates just because he knew how to ask good questions. He became Socrates because he lived those questions every single day, because he had the courage to use them even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was dangerous, even when it cost him his life. And now you're at a crossroads. You can close this video, think what you learned was interesting, and go back to living exactly the way you always have. Or you can choose to do something different. Let me offer you a challenge that can change your life if you're brave enough to accept it. For the next 30 days, commit to using these three Socratic questions in at least one meaningful conversation every day. It can be with your partner, your kids, your friends, your co-workers, even strangers. Don't use the questions to attack or embarrass anyone. Use them with genuine curiosity, with a real desire to understand the people around you. But here's the most important part of the challenge. At the end of each day, before you go to sleep, ask yourself those same three questions about something you believe. Pick a different belief each day. It can be about anything: your life goals, your relationships, your work, your values, your political views, your religious beliefs, anything at all. And be brutally honest with your answers. I promise you this: if you do this for 30 days, you won't be the same person anymore. You'll have deeper conversations. You'll understand people better. You'll understand yourself better. You'll make wiser decisions. You'll live with more integrity. And all of it will come from having the courage to question, just like Socrates did more than 2,400 years ago. Now I need to tell you about Socrates' legacy, because this is where the story becomes even more powerful. When Socrates died, his enemies thought they had won. They believed that by silencing the questioner, they could return to their comfortable illusions. But the exact opposite happened. Socrates' death turned him into a martyr for philosophy. His ideas spread far more after his death than they ever did during his life. Plato, his most famous student, dedicated his entire life to recording Socrates' dialogues. Those dialogues went on to shape Western philosophy. Aristotle studied under Plato. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. Alexander spread Greek culture across the known world. And through that chain, Socrates' 3 questions reached you, here today, more than 2,000 years later. Think about that. A man who never wrote a single word. A man executed as a criminal. A man who died appearing to be defeated ended up changing the course of human history. How? Through questions, through an unshakable commitment to truth, through a refusal to accept easy answers to hard questions, through the courage to question all the way to the end, no matter the cost. And here's something that should give you chills. The same forces that killed Socrates still exist today. Ignorance disguised as wisdom, arrogance disguised as confidence, fear of questioning disguised as certainty, people who prefer comfortable illusions over uncomfortable truths, people who attack those who ask hard questions instead of facing the answers. But just as in Socrates' time, truth always wins in the end. It may take time, it may come at a high cost. But truth uncovered through honest questioning is more powerful than any lie, no matter how well it's told. And by learning these 3 questions, you've become part of that ancient tradition of truth seekers. Now let me share one final secret about Socrates that few people truly understand. He didn't ask questions just to uncover external truths about the world. He asked questions primarily to uncover internal truths about himself. He believed that real knowledge already exists inside each person, waiting to be brought to the surface. Questions are simply the tools that help deliver that knowledge. That means when you ask these 3 questions to someone else, you're not just learning about them, you're helping them learn about themselves. You're acting as a midwife for ideas, just like Socrates did. You're helping give birth to clarity, self-awareness, and wisdom. And there is no greater gift you can give someone than helping them think more clearly about their own life. So let's recap everything so you never forget it. The 3 Socratic questions that allow you to truly understand how someone thinks are: first, what do you mean by that? This question forces clarity and precision. Second, how did you come to that conclusion? This question exposes the reasoning process. Third, is this consistent with other things you believe? This question reveals contradictions and demands intellectual honesty. But more important than memorizing these questions is embodying the spirit behind them, the spirit of genuine curiosity, the spirit of intellectual humility, the spirit of an unwavering commitment to truth, the courage to question even when it's uncomfortable. That was Socrates' spirit, and it can be yours too. You know what I find most inspiring about Socrates? He never claimed to have all the answers. In fact, he constantly emphasized that he knew nothing, but he possessed something far more valuable than answers. He had the right questions, and in the end, the right questions are more valuable than ready-made answers. Answers make us stop. Questions keep us moving forward. Every generation has to ask its own questions. Every person has to discover their own truths. You can't just accept the answers that worked for your parents, your teachers, or society. You have to question them, examine them, test them to see if they work for you, in your time, in your unique circumstances. And that process never ends. It's a lifelong journey, so if you've made it this far, congratulations. You've shown exactly the kind of persistence and curiosity that Socrates valued. Most people would have checked out a long time ago, but you stayed. You wanted to fully understand. You followed the truth all the way to the end. That says a lot about who you are. Now I want to hear from you. If you watched until the end, write in the comments, "I accept the Socratic challenge." That public commitment will push you to actually apply what you've learned. And then, over the next few days, come back and share your experience. Talk about the conversations you had. Talk about what you discovered about others and about yourself. Let's build a community of questioners, just like Socrates did in Athens. And if you truly took this seriously, if you really understand the value of these 3 questions, then you have a responsibility to share this knowledge. Don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who could benefit from it. Teach these questions to your kids. Use them in your conversations. Become a force for critical thinking and self-awareness in the world. Because the world desperately needs more people who ask questions instead of repeating borrowed answers. More people who seek truth instead of defending opinions. More people with the courage Socrates had to question, examine, and live according to what they discover is true. And here's my final question for you, the most important one of all. What do you truly want from your life? Not what your parents want. Not what society expects. Not what looks impressive on paper. What do you, deep down, genuinely want? And are the choices you're making every day taking you closer to that truth or further away from it? Those are Socratic questions only you can answer, and those answers will determine whether you live an authentic life or a borrowed one, whether you're the author of your own story or just a character in someone else's script, whether you merely exist or truly live. Socrates left us a priceless gift. The art of asking questions that reveal truth. But that gift only matters if you use it. So use it, question, examine, live an examined life, because, as Socrates said, an unexamined life is not worth living. If you enjoyed this kind of deep content, subscribe to the channel for more practical philosophy that can genuinely change your life. And on the screen right now are 2 videos you shouldn't miss. One on how the Stoics dealt with difficult people, and another on Aristotle's techniques of persuasion. Both will perfectly complement what you learned today and give you even more tools to live with wisdom and purpose. Remember this, you now carry Socrates' legacy. Use it wisely, use it humbly, use it in the service of truth, and when your time comes, may it be said of you what was said of Socrates. Here lived someone who had the courage to question all the way to the end. I accept the Socratic challenge. Do you?